In this video, we're going to compare the C5 Corvette brakes, and they're all essentially the same, whether they came on a Z06, convertible, or coupe, against the base entry-level brakes that came on an awful lot of C6 Corvettes, so long as they weren't Grand Sports, Z06s, or ZR1s. The goal of the video is simply to see if the C5 brakes are the same as the entry-level base brakes that came on a ton of C6 Corvettes, or are they different? And if they are different, might this be a low-cost brake upgrade path for your C5 Corvette? Let's dig into it and find out next.
Toys for Life.
Let's start out with the C5 Corvette's brakes because it is a super easy story to tell. In fact, it is so easy, the average second grader could easily follow along.
Who knows what a cow says? Susie.
A cow says moo.
Excellent.
And that means that if you were to clone me, there's a 50-50 chance that my clone could follow along as well. So here's the scoop. Every single C5 Corvette that was sold to the general public, including the very track-capable C5 Z06, came with the exact same brake calipers, brake rotors, and brake pads. Now, yes, I'm sure somewhere along the line during the C5's production run, the recipe for the brake pad material probably had some changes, but other than that, the only thing that you could actually put your thumb on as being a physical difference between all of the C5 brakes and the C5 Z06 would be that the C5 Z06 came with red calipers. Now, your C5 Corvette could have red calipers as well, whether or not it's a Z06, as could any C5 you happen to run into. That's because red calipers happen to look pretty nice, and because they do, plenty of idiots out there, including me, paint their calipers red. So in 2024, the color of the brake calipers on a C5 Corvette means about this much. Now let's move on to the C6 Corvette, and times must have been good for GM during the C6's production run because clearly the brake engineers had their budget increased. At least that's what the evidence suggests. The C6 Corvette was in production for 9 years, and during that production run, the brake engineering squad came up with 4 different brake options that could be on your C6 Corvette, depending on which model and year is sitting in your garage. Now contrast that with the C5 Corvette that was in production for 8 years, and during that time, there was only 1 brake option you could get. Think about that for just a second. Before we get to the C6's entry-level base brakes, let's go through the 3 more advanced options, starting in descending order from super exotic and expensive to decent, relatively basic, and inexpensive. You got the top of the line option code J57 brakes if you brought your checkbook and a big pile of cash to the dealership and bought the Corvette known as the Blue Devil, which is this one right here.
But when Chevrolet wanted to race the 638 horsepower Corvette ZR1 against Porsche, Ferrari, and BMW, we were asked to dial it back. Oh, about 168 horsepower, just to be fair.
That's right, the C6 ZR1 and the carbon C6 Z06 came with the very exotic and expensive ceramic carbon brake rotors. That's Porsche, Lamborghini, Ferrari, and even Tesla plaid hardware territory right there. Now, I'm sure they work fantastic, and they had better work better than fantastic and last a hell of a long time to boot as well, because if you ever need new ones, you're going to really want to make sure you're sitting down. A set of 4 brand new carbon ceramic brake rotors will set you back over $5,000, and that's if you get them from Rock Auto. But don't worry, the brake calipers are much more affordable. They'll only set you back about $2,000 for a set of 4. So unless the Toys for Life YouTube channel becomes immensely more popular or somebody out there leaves me a small fortune, there will be no carbon ceramic brake rotors going on my C6 anytime soon. So let's move on to one of the other C6 brake options that's a little bit more affordable. The second best brake option, known as the J56 that came with C6 Corvettes, came with one of the best Corvettes ever made, the C6 Z06. And the same J56 brake package could also be found on the C6 Grand Sport, which also had the same beautiful red 6-piston front calipers with 14-inch rotors and 4-piston rear calipers with 13.4-inch rotors. This brake package performed very well on the street, and as you just saw, they look simply amazing. Now obviously the J56 brakes from the C6 Z06 are substantially larger than the entry-level brakes found on the C6, and we'll get to these in just a second. And until just a few short years ago, they were a very popular brake upgrade for lower-level C6s and C5 Corvettes as well. However, since the C6 has been out of production now for over a decade, the C6 Z06 brake hardware is getting harder and harder to find, which means the prices are, well, you get the point. So if a serious brake upgrade is in your C5 or your C6's future, in my humble opinion, you're probably going to want to look towards the aftermarket, and that's a video for another day. The third brake option that could be on your C6 Corvette is technically known as the J55 option. However, right, wrong, or other, many people simply refer to it as the Z51 package or simply the heavy-duty brakes. The J55 brakes use the same caliper up front as the base level brakes do. However, different caliper mounting brackets were used front and rear in order to push that caliper out a little bit to make room for slightly larger rotors. The rear J55 caliper, located way back there, was in fact different than the base C6 rear caliper because of the fact that it needed to use a smaller piston in the caliper in order to maintain the proper front to rear brake bias. This is because the front rotor on the J55 package is about 0.6 inches larger than the base rotor, and the rear rotor on the J55 package is a full 1 inch larger than the base rotor. Now, in addition to the J55 rotors being slightly larger than the stock rotors, they also come drilled as well, which absolutely adds to the bling factor that a lot of people like. However, having drilled rotors can introduce additional problems depending on how they're going to be used. And finally, that leaves us with the base C6 brake package known as the JL9 code. And luckily, they're pretty decent brakes, and I just happen to have a set right here that we can take a close look at. Oh my goodness, it looks a little bit like a tornado has gone through the Toys for Life shop. The base C6 JL9 brake rotors are exactly the same size as the C5s. They're 12.8 inches up front and 12 inches in the rear, and both the front and back rotors share the exact same thickness as the rotors on the C5 as well. But the interesting thing is, the rotors are not the same. All four of the C5's rotors have directional venting vanes that act like a fan and suck air in from down low by the bearing, up through the rotor and out towards the tires. As you can see when looking at the C5 rotors from above, the venting vanes are pointed towards the rear of the car, and it's the same way on the opposite side, which creates the desired air movement, of course, when the rotors are spinning. One bad part about this design is that it requires 4 individual unique rotors, one for each corner of the C5, and that means there's twice as many parts to stock. The vents inside the C6 rotors appear to have kind of ditched any sort of an attempt to move any air when they're spinning, because as you can see when looking down from the top of the rotor, gone are anything that looks like a turbine style vane, and instead there's just these offset connections that connect the two rotor faces. Also, the Corvette community seems to agree that the C6 rotors are built a little beefier than the C5s, and to me, at least visually, it appears that way as well. So why were the directional air vanes that were used on the C5 not carried over to the C6? Was it determined that the amount of airflow was insignificant? Perhaps it was simply an effort to reduce part numbers. I suspect only the GM engineers know for sure. Another difference that's quite obvious when you take a look between the C5 and the C6 front rotors is the design of the rotor hat. And from the research that I've done, apparently the C6 rotor hats were redesigned to better withstand cracking when exposed to the high heat that track use brings out in a rotor. Sometimes the rotors get so hot that they even glow. When I look at the two designs, and I'm certainly not an engineer, but that theory does seem to make sense to me. If you happen to know for sure, or you've got a different theory, I'd love to hear it. Please leave it in the comments below. Alright, so at this point you might be wondering if you can use the base JL9 C6 rotors on a C5 Corvette. I believe you can. I've read several accounts of people that say they've done it or they've seen it done. I read somewhere someone said the offsets are different, so I did measure the offsets of the C5 and the C6 rotors, and to me they appear to be the same. So if you believe that losing the directional vanes on the C5 rotors in exchange for the potentially more durable C6 rotor hats is worthwhile, it's something you might want to try. If you've done this yourself firsthand or you've seen somebody else do it, please drop that in the comments. We'd love to hear it. Moving on to the stock JL9 C6 front brake caliper versus the C5's brake caliper. You don't have to have 20/20 vision to realize they're completely different castings. Now, why would the GM brake engineering squad do this? And furthermore, why would the bean counters let them? The conventional theory from the serious C5 and C6 road course track guys is that the C6 calipers were beefed up so that they can resist spreading under sustained high temperature track use, which apparently can and does happen from time to time with the C5 calipers. Since the C5 Z06 was promoted as a track car and since all C5s share the same brake calipers, I can see why GM might tweak the design. No need to do any recalls as this only affects a small percentage of all C5 owners. Instead, just have the vendor that's making the C6 calipers tweak the casting just a little bit to make it more robust, and the hardcore C5 guys will figure out the upgrade on their own. This seems plausible to me. Let us know in the comments below if you can confirm this or if you have another theory. Moving to the back end here in the stock JL9 rear calipers, and this one is super easy. The calipers look identical. They have the same manufacturer and patent numbers cast into the side of the calipers, and when you look up the part numbers between the C5 and the C6, they're identical. Case closed. They are the same. This leaves us with only one more piece of hardware to discuss, and that would be the rear rotors. As we discussed before, the C5 does have those directional vanes cast into the rotor, and the C6 doesn't. And as far as the brake rotor hats go, at first glance they look the same, but if you look closer, the way that the hat and the rotor brake surface come together are very different, likely once again to be an improvement to withstand heat better. I also took a few seconds to check the offset of the wheel mounting face on the rotor against the exterior brake face of the rotor, and they are the same. I also looked up the rear parking brake shoe part numbers for the C6 and the C5, and they are identical, so in my view, the rotors are in fact interchangeable. So here are the key takeaways for me anyway from today's video. Number one, I learned something that seriously really surprised me, and that is that drilled rotors are mainly for show in 2024. Serious track guys won't use them because they crack too easily when exposed to extreme use. Number two, if you want a nice bling upgrade for your C5 or your base C6 brakes for that matter, then the J55 brakes are noticeably bigger, and in my opinion, they do look quite a bit nicer. However, due to the fact that the rotors are drilled, they are not superior, but they're certainly good enough for street use. If you like the way they look, especially if you have larger rims on your C5 or C6 that are making your existing brakes look puny, then they can be a worthwhile upgrade, but make sure you find the parts used at a reasonable price. Number three, C6 Z06 brakes look fantastic, but they've gotten hard to find and they're quite expensive. And again, because of the fact they have drilled rotors, they are not the best brakes for serious track use. Of course, you could switch them over to solid rotors, which should help them out tremendously. So in 2024, if you really need a serious brake upgrade for your C5 or C6 for track use, you probably want to look towards the aftermarket. But if you've got your heart set on C6 Z06 brakes, if you're patient and you look often, you might be able to score a set on eBay. That's going to do it for this one, guys. I've got to put all of this stuff back together. If you learned anything on today's video, please hit that thumbs up, subscribe so you don't miss the next video, and most of all, thanks for watching.